for your questions.
Thank you. Director Wray. When Orwell first wrote 1984, people were concerned about that dystopian future, what it might mean. Big Brother invaded our privacy, our homes, our communications. But defenders of privacy took some consolation in the fact that the technology didn't exist for two-way TVs, and so much of it seems so futuristic. Now U.S. intelligence agencies have the ability to record and listen to every phone call in the world. We've sometimes collected phone calls from an entire country for an entire month at a time. We even have done it here at home in America. For years, the NSA collected millions of Americans' data without first having an individualized warrant. James Clapper notoriously lied, as we all know, to Congress about this massive surveillance program. He's now paid to deliver highly partisan rhetoric on a left-wing news outlet. Many in the FBI have been accused of bias. Some have been convicted. Some have been let go. McCabe, Klein Smith, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page. So it's kind of hard to argue that somehow we can get people in the FBI that are above bias. It seems to be something that goes with the territory. Maybe it was a bad spate of time where we had a whole bunch of them all at once, but it's a problem. When we investigate a presidential campaign, I think it's important that we realize the potential for bias that exists in the people bringing an investigation forward, but also incredibly important that we should devolve or at least consider using the Constitution and not using warrants that are used on foreigners. So we have two different standards. We have a constitutional standard, which is typically used for Americans, where we use the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment says you have to have probable cause, of a crime. The FISA court standard is not a Fourth Amendment. It's an extra constitutional standard. It's less than the Constitution. It's probable cause of being associated with a foreign government. The problem is that when we have presidential candidates, they're all going to have foreign policy advisors. Most of them will have long-standing history in either government of some sort. They'll have people who do talk to foreigners all of the time. So you can see how someone with bias, and I think that's what happened during the investigation that turned out to be untrue on the Russia collusion. So we had a massive investigation of a presidential campaign. And I don't think enough of us have stepped back to say, well, my goodness, should we be using FISA warrants for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court? Should we be using that kind of warrant on an American, particularly an American running for office who has all of these contacts? Do you think it's appropriate that we use FISA court warrants to investigate presidential campaigns?
What I do think is appropriate is that we use FISA warrants to investigate counterintelligence threats to the United States, as long as it's done consistent with the minimization and querying procedures that are carefully approved.
You don't think there was any problem with this investigation with the Crossfire Hurricane? You think it was all completely appropriate? Nobody in the chain of command was biased, and it just occurred because they were curious? We just indicted one of the Clinton lawyers yesterday for lying to you guys. You guys took it hook, line, and sinker and said, oh, well, we'll just investigate a major presidential candidate. Of course there's a huge problem. And if you don't see that there's a problem and that we need more controls on this and that we need to somehow obey the Constitution, I would say the same for President Biden. I would say the same for a president of any party. What a crazy upturned world where there would be, the bias is there. There's no way to get it. The reason we have checks and balances with the judiciary is so we can kind of get over the potential bias that occurs in the FBI or the CIA or anywhere else. If you don't have to go to a court and you go to a court that doesn't obey the Constitution, that's held in secret, that's not justice, and it's going to be ripe for abuse. You don't agree with that?
There are parts of what you said that I'd like to weigh in on. So first, as to what happened in the so-called Crossfire Hurricane matter, I would say to you today, and I have said publicly on a number of occasions, that what that Inspector General report describes by certain FBI personnel, I consider to be unacceptable and unrepresentative of the FBI that I see every day, having joined in 2017, and not something that I think can ever happen again. So I want to make sure that you and I are talking not past each other on that. Now, second, I've put in place over 40 corrective measures, everything the Inspector General has recommended, and then some, to make sure that what happened there does not happen again.
I think that's admirable, and I appreciate that point of view. But, when Hamilton wrote that if men were angels, we wouldn't need the Constitution, we still are relying on angels working at the FBI. We're relying on you saying we're going to get a better set of people. We're not going to have that bias anymore. I think that's admirable. That's what I would want in someone being the director. But what we need is something beyond that, and this is what our founding fathers did when they set up the Fourth Amendment, is we had a Constitution, and we had the Fourth Amendment, an incredibly important amendment, and then we had a judicial system. The FISA court doesn't obey the Fourth Amendment. It has a less than constitutional standard. It allows you to have warrants without obeying the Fourth Amendment. And people don't realize this. You use FISA warrants that do not obey the Fourth Amendment. You have a lower standard for going after foreigners. I'm actually okay with that. If you're not a U.S. citizen and you're investigating someone overseas and you're eavesdropping on them, I'm actually fine with the FISA standard. But I'm not fine with the FISA standard for Americans, particularly Americans who are running for office, particularly for the person running for the highest office who is interconnected with all kinds of countries and always will be. And once you get biased people, once there's not perfection, and we get biased people in the FBI, the problem is the system can be abused. I think the only fix, it's admirable to have some regulations and some checks and balances you put in place, but the only real fix would be we should obey the Constitution. I don't think Americans nor political candidates should be investigated using a foreign intelligence surveillance court.
Thank you, Senator, for your kind words about the corrective measures we've put in place. I would say to you that I believe the FISA court operates within the Constitution, so we might have a difference of opinion in how we characterize it. I would also say to you that here, as we sit here 20 years after 9/11, and as somebody who was in FBI headquarters on the day of those attacks and saw the immediate aftermath as we started to reverse engineer what went wrong on 9/11, much has been discussed back in those years about the so-called wall that was built up between law enforcement and intelligence. And a lot of the reforms that have occurred, thanks to this Congress, thanks to the courts, thanks to the executive branch, to make sure that there is not a wall between the information sharing that has to occur, has been part of what's kept Americans safe since then. So I would want, of course, to work with you on any ideas that you have, but also to make sure that we don't rebuild the wall that made us all less safe and cost 3,000 innocent lives on the day of those attacks. Thank you.
I appreciate your opinion on the FISA court having the same standard as the Constitution. They don't. The Fourth Amendment says you have to have probable cause that someone has committed a crime or is committing a crime. It's a much different standard. The FISA court standard is probable cause that you have a relationship with a foreign government. It's a much lower standard, much more open to abuse, and you don't have a public court or judges which might protect the rights of an individual. If what happened in Crossfire Hurricane is allowed to stand and would allow the FBI to do this again, we can see a time when the intelligence agencies can completely take over our political process. It's a very dangerous thing, and I think most people got caught up in the partisanship of the time, whether they liked or disliked President Trump. And instead of really thinking about this, there still is a problem. To my mind, we need to reform the FISA system, and we should not use FISA warrants on Americans. It should be reserved because it's a lower constitutional standard, should be reserved for foreigners.
Thank you, Senator Paul. Senator Scott, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, each of you, for being here. Secretary Mayorkas, are you responsible for DHS, responsible for vetting all the Afghan refugees coming in?
I am responsible for the work of the department.
Sure. So since, let's say since the 1st of August, how many Afghan refugees have been denied entrance into the United States?
I don't have that number at my fingertips. I know it is very de minimis.
Okay.
In terms of,
Why would that be?
because we have not found many people with derogatory information relative to those who qualify for admission to the United States by reason of their status.
Okay. So the Afghan refugees that have gotten into the United States in our bases, if you found something, what's your process? How could you send them home? What's your process for doing that?
So there are a number of options available to us, Senator. Number one, we can, of course, seek their voluntary return to a third country. Number two, we place them, if there is a reason to do so, we would place them in enforcement proceedings and seek their removal immediately.
And you would be able to, you believe you'd be able to send them back to Afghanistan?
Well, whether it's Afghanistan, that's something under review, but whether it's Afghanistan or another country, we would indeed seek their removal from the United States.
Okay. So your DHS was set up as a result of 9/11, right? And so, and we've had significant military presence in Afghanistan for quite a while. It's gone. So now we don't have the same ability to defend the homeland that we did when we had military in Afghanistan. So what changes have you made to make sure that DHS is doing its job to make sure Americans are safe?
So, Senator, the architecture that has been built over 20 years since 9/11 remains in place and is only strengthened. We have a screening and vetting architecture. We have greater cooperation amongst the federal agencies in the counterterrorism, intelligence, and law enforcement communities. We remain ever vigilant in that regard.
Okay. Do you and Director Wray, do you agree that the Taliban is a terrorist organization?
I agree that the Taliban is a terrorist organization.
I believe it is identified as such, Senator.
Sure. So earlier this month, the Taliban announced the senior leadership. One notable appointment was Sirhan Haqqani to be Afghan's interior minister. He's on the FBI's most wanted list and designated as a global terrorist due to his role in the January 2008 attack on a hotel in Kabul that killed 6 people, including an American citizen. Director Wray, is there still a $10 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Haqqani?
To my knowledge, he remains on the list, and the reward is still out there.
Okay. All right. Do each of you agree that it seems to be counterintuitive that it would be against national security interests for somebody like that to be in senior leadership of the Taliban? We'd all agree with that, right?
Yes.
Yep. And we've had conflicting testimony about how many people are left there. We've had someone, Secretary Blinken said 100 citizens to 200. We've had earlier that it could be as much as 9,000. We don't know exactly what it is. First off, were 2 of you disappointed when our military came home without all the American citizens?
If I may, Senator, the United States government's enduring commitment is to bring every United States citizen that wants to return to the United States to bring them home. That is our enduring and continuing commitment.
But were you disappointed that it didn't happen before we brought our military home?
Our goal was to return every willing American citizen home, and of course we were disappointed if we were not able to accomplish that, but we have not stopped in our efforts.
Okay. Dr. Wray?
Well, certainly, I would be disappointed if we don't do right by all those Afghans who worked so bravely side by side with us over the past 20 years. And that's why we're all working so hard, as Secretary Mayorkas said, to try to make sure that we get the right people, underline the right people, out where they can be brought to safety. I do want to clarify my answer to an earlier question. I've been handed a note that while the reward, this is on the Haqqani question, that while the reward is definitely still out there, that as I understand it, Haqqani may no longer be on the top 10 most wanted terrorists.
Well, he's still on the list.
But still to have the reward is still posted.
Okay, so first off, were you, Dr. Wray, were you disappointed that we didn't get all of our, just even American citizens, let alone all the individuals that helped us? Were you disappointed that those all didn't come home before our military left?
Well, obviously, we want to make sure that we get all the right people out, including American citizens. I know that everybody worked very hard to move a massive amount of people in a very short period of time, and the FBI was able to play a small part in helping other agencies on that.
So what do the 2 of you believe is going to be our ability to continue to get Americans home, or on top of that, individuals that have helped us, when you've got a terrorist and on our FBI most wanted list, or maybe not the top 10, but some number, and he's part of leadership there. What's our chance that actually this is going to happen, that we're going to get American citizens home, or Afghans that helped us?
We're extraordinarily dedicated to that, and I think Secretary Blinken has spoken powerfully about that actions will speak louder than words with respect to the Taliban's willingness to work with us. to effect the evacuation of individuals who have worked with us or United States citizens that want to leave Afghanistan. I should say that a number of U.S. citizens are Afghan nationals and have expressed a desire to stay. So, but our commitment is enduring and unrelenting.
So, Secretary Myers, let's go to the border just for a second before I finish. You know, before, you know, after you're nominated, we talked, you talked about you're going to enforce the law. Do you realize just, you know, when Senator Johnson was asking questions, you said that you thought the border was secure. Do you realize that if you talk to a typical American now and you hear the numbers, that over 1 million people have come here illegally this year? We only have a little over 300 million people live in this country. So 1 out of every 300 people in this country today have come here illegally in 8 months, right? Isn't that inconsistent with what you're saying, though? I mean,
Senator, I don't believe so. First of all, the number of encounters isn't necessarily individual encounters, but rather we see some level of recidivism in light of our exercise of the Title 42 expulsion authority under the CDC's legal powers. We apprehend, expel, and remove a considerable number of people. I know Senator Johnson took me to task for not having the data immediately at my fingertips in this hearing, but in fact, I do have some August numbers that I could provide that actually reflect the number of apprehensions, the distinction between total encounters and number of unique individuals encountered, the number of individuals expelled under Title 42, and the number of individuals processed for expedited removal under Title 8 of the United States Code. I do have those numbers for August.
so it's over 200,000 were apprehended, right?
In total encounters in August of 2021 was 208,887. Unique encounters were, meaning unique individuals, were 156,641.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Remind our members, we do have a second round. Thank you, Senator. Senator Romney, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for the work that you do to help keep our homeland safe. Director Wray, are the threats from the domestic violent extremists rising? And if they are they rising based on those that are, if you will, inspired from foreign groups, or are they rising from those that are inspired by domestic groups? Or, and I don't know whether you distinguish that way, but is it on the right? My impression is that it's substantially increasing, but largely domestic, but that may not be the case. So are the threats greater from these individuals and by source, domestic or international?
So we would, when it comes to sort of homeland-based terrorist threats, we have two buckets really that we primarily focus on as the highest priority right now. What we call homegrown violent extremists, which is a reference to people here radicalized by foreign terrorist organizations and ideologies. And then domestic violent extremists who are radicalized more by everything from racial animus all the way over to anti-government, anti-authority.
Right.
The first bucket, the homegrown violent extremists, has been humming along fairly consistently at about 1,000 investigations, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, over the last few years. The domestic violent extremist bucket has been going up quite significantly over the last few years, which is why we're now at 2,700 domestic terrorism investigations, when if you went back 2.5 years ago, we were probably at more about 1,000. So it's been a really significant jump there. We are concerned that with developments in Afghanistan, among other things, that there will be more inspiration to the first bucket as well. So I think we anticipate, unfortunately, growth in both categories as we look ahead over the next couple of years.
Yeah, that is daunting, and we may get a chance to talk about why you might believe that the latter group, the homegrown, domestic-inspired violent extremists, is rising. Secretary Mayorkas, you know, I think any unbiased person would say that the Biden administration's border and immigration policies have been nothing short of a monumental disaster. And were there not so many other disasters that the administration is encountering, it probably would be by itself enough for a government to be hanging on by a thread. We've had our disagreements in the past about how much of the illegal immigration problem is caused by pull versus push factors, and your view that we need to address so-called root causes, which is poverty and corruption in other countries. My view is that we can't solve the problems of the rest of the world, in fact, we can't solve all of our own problems, let alone for the rest of the world. But what we can address are the unnecessary pull factors, if you will, the unnecessary features that we have in place that draw people into coming into our country illegally. And let me just discuss with taxes. If an illegal individual wants to work here and wants to pay U.S. taxes, they're able to do that. Is that right? They're able to do that by getting an identification number. Is that right?
I believe they are, Senator.
Yeah, I think they're called an I-10. They can apply for an I-10. They are able to do so. Under the administration's human infrastructure bill, their children can also get an I-10, can also get that tax number for the same purpose or for whatever purpose they might have.
I don't know the answer to your question, Senator.
The answer is yes, they can. The president's so-called human infrastructure bill also provides $300 per month for every child who obtains such a number. So under the bill that is being proposed and considered by Congress, we will be paying an illegal immigrant $300 per month for each and every one of their children that obtain such a number. So a family of 4 who'd come here illegally would receive as much as $1,200 per month in checks from the U.S. government. Well, of course, well above the wage and the average wage throughout major parts of Latin America. Do you think that this provision, which would allow the children of those that have come here illegally to receive monthly payments, would represent an unfortunate and damaging pull factor that would draw people more and more people into our country illegally?
Senator, I think that speaks to the fact that we have more than 11 million undocumented individuals already present in the United States, a population that has been growing for decades by reason of a broken immigration system. I don't think it speaks to individuals who have not arrived in the United States.
Well, clearly, if you can get paid $300 per child, even though the child is here illegally and you're here illegally, that's going to encourage people to come here. It also is going to represent a major expense for our government to pay the children of those that are here illegally $300 per month. It's one, it's expensive, and two, it creates a greater draw to come to the country. Director, a question I'd ask you and perhaps the others as well, which is, it does strike me that 3 of you all have a very similar responsibility to protect our homeland from violence and extremists of various kinds. Are the lines of responsibility clear as to who is doing what, or do things fall between the cracks? Is there duplication, which is unnecessary? Should we be addressing how we organize this effort? Because I recognize we're asking all 3 of you very similar questions. You're looking at very similar aspects of the same challenge we have, which is protecting the homeland. Should we rethink how we do this? Are we duplicating the work? Or Director Wray, any one of you could respond to that.
Well, I guess I would speak to it from the perspective of somebody who was heavily involved in this mission on the day of 9/11 and in the first 4 years afterwards, and then coming back from the private sector now. And I think we are well organized against the terrorist threat. We do have, I would view as not overlapping responsibilities, but complementary ones. And I do think that one of the real positive developments learned the hard way from 9/11 is how well we all work together. Our folks in particular work well with other agencies as well on the terrorist threat. And I think there are valuable lessons to be learned from that. Doesn't mean that it can't always be improved. I tend to be dissatisfied by nature. So I expect continued improvement, but I think we're on the right track as far as that goes. And Lord knows we need it, because the threats, as we just discussed, are not getting easier, they're getting harder.
Thank you, Director.
Senator,
Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Ossoff, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Secretary Mayorkas, want to thank you and your team for responding to the letter, the bipartisan letter that I sent with Senator Scott requesting reforms to FEMA disaster relief practices that were discriminatory against Black Americans, especially in the South. Grateful to you and your team for making those reforms. Would like to ask you, please, how would you characterize the specific mission of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and what differentiates it from the other 17 component agencies in the intelligence community?
So if I can, it dovetails with the question that Senator Romney asked. I think we're cooperating and are more cohesive now than we ever have been before. And I think that to the extent that we sometimes have redundancies, those are intentional redundancies for a belt and suspenders approach to our homeland security and our national security. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis is really an office of partnership. What it does is it gathers information and intelligence from across the threat landscape, and what it is uniquely situated to do is to push that information and intelligence out to our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners so that the first responder community is equipped and empowered to address the threat in its communities. One of the things that the Office of Intelligence and Analysis has become so much better at over the past 9 months is, in fact, working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the Joint Joint Terrorist Task Force model, and we partner in the dissemination of information bulletins, conference calls, and the like with local law enforcement.
Thank you. Director Abizaid, how would you rate the quality of information sharing across the IC